In this presentation, we are going to look at what are some of the key considerations that you need to think about when planning and designing your on-ground project, specifically from the perspective of our Grassroots Grants program. Now, there are a number of reasons why we'd want to look at this. Obviously, the first one is so that your project can be completed successfully and you achieve all the things that you set out to achieve. But importantly, from a grant assessment panel perspective, how can you accurately convey your project? And also from a visual perspective, how can you represent it so that the assessment panel has a really clear understanding of what it is you are trying to achieve? So just some quick context about Green Adelaide. We are one of the 9 landscape boards in South Australia, obviously the Metropolitan Landscape Board. As you can see on the map, our region goes from the Gawler River in the north down to Sellex and across the Hills Face Zone. We have a motto or an aim to create a cooler, greener, wilder, more climate resilient Adelaide. And we do this not on our own, but in partnership with the community. So it might be individuals, volunteer groups, local government, businesses, etc. We all work together to achieve our aim. And this is where our grants program comes in, by funding a wide cross-section of our community to work with us to achieve that cooler, greener, wilder outcome. The map on the right shows the broad habitat types that were found in pre-European times in the Green Adelaide region. As you can see, roughly 50% of it was grassland or grassy woodlands. There's obviously a significant freshwater system to the west of the CBD, lots of coastal vegetation, and obviously it gets more wooded towards the hills. Now, the Adelaide Plains and the Mount Lofty Ranges together are considered a biodiversity hotspot. They're only one of 15 hotspots throughout Australia. So the region obviously had a really diverse plant, animal and fungal communities. As you can imagine, when you build a major metropolitan area in our region, the natural biodiversity suffers. The pie chart on the left, the area that is shaded red, shows you the extent of clearing. But it's not all doom and gloom. The level of biodiversity still remains relatively high, and there are some amazing pockets of remnant vegetation and plants and animals that exist. The map in the middle of the screen is a visual representation of the pie chart from the previous slide. Now, as you can see, not all vegetation types have been cleared equally. There's a big patch of mangroves and samphire just to the north. There's, as you can see, the green patches along the Hills Face Zone, lots of conservation parks and national parks. But essentially, the reason for showing this map is it gives us a fantastic opportunity, almost a blank slate in some places, to cool, green and rewild our region. The map on the right actually shows the tree canopy cover, so the current tree canopy cover. Now, you may remember from the other map on the previous slide that a lot of our area, especially to the north, was grassland or grassy woodland. So obviously, naturally, there wouldn't have been a huge canopy or tree canopy cover there. However, the rest of the map, you can see there's a significant reduction in tree canopy. And particularly from a climate perspective, a climate change perspective, obviously the projections are that the area is going to have increased temperatures, more frequent heat waves, more regular storms, etc. So the more that we can regreen our community, the better we are going to be able to combat climate change, but also make our area where we live much more enjoyable, much more livable. So that's all the background out the way. Now it's time to focus on the actual project planning and design component. For any project, you require a project plan. A well-defined project plan will outline what are your project's goals, what are the objectives, and what's the scope of the project. This ensures that everyone involved has a clear understanding of what it is that needs to be achieved. When I say everyone involved, I don't just mean your group. It could be any contractors or consultants that are involved, or any volunteers that you have. Essentially, anyone that is part of your project, you're all on the same page and you have a clear understanding of what the outcomes are going to be with your project. To help you with your project plan, we've developed a number of planning principles. And so as you can see on the screen, starting with purpose, what is the purpose of your project? And going around clockwise. For the rest of the presentation, we're going to address each of those and give you some examples and explain what it is that the assessment panel is looking for and how you might be able to incorporate some of that into your project. The other thing to keep in mind is that every project is unique. For example, you might have a particular purpose. Your site assessment, which we obviously will talk about, is unique to your site. So as we go through these, the examples I give are obviously really broad. If you did want specific advice about your project, feel free to get in touch with one of the Green Adelaide staff members listed in the grant guidelines. The first planning principle, and probably one of the most important ones, is what is the purpose of your site? What I'm going to do now is just show you some examples of projects that we've funded in the past that have different purposes. The current slide, as you can see, has examples of outdoor spaces that were created to improve the amenity for use. The example on the left is the Friends of Cobbler Creek, where they created a children's garden. Marrickville Primary in the middle, they have a gathering space. Not all of the vegetation has grown yet, but you get the general idea what that is going to look like. And the example on the right, the school there, they had a disused space at the end of their oval, or the edge of their oval, and they created a native garden specifically using Aboriginal medicinal plants, fibre plants and food plants. And they engaged an Aboriginal educator to help them develop that. Just a slight disclaimer with the middle example, the seating is not something that Green Adelaide funds, but any applicant is welcome to fund that themselves. The next lot of examples are projects whose purpose was to cool and green. The one on the left is a great example of a car park. So as you understand, they get really hot in summer. So by providing tree canopy cover and other vegetation, that can help to cool and obviously green that space. The middle two photos are from community verge gardens, where the one on the left is from Mile End, the one on the right is from Kent Town. So those residents got together and obviously improved the curbside and the vegetation that grows there. And the final example on the right, the area around ovals. So obviously people watching, for example, cricket in summer, having a nice tree canopy cover, providing that shade can obviously help to cool and green that environment. The examples here are ones that focus on conservation. So it's a bit of a mix of preserving remnant vegetation through to actually planting or revegetating. And the other on the right is weed control and allowing natural regeneration to occur. That project also did include a little bit of revegetation. So as I said, conservation being the main focus or the main purpose, these are some really good examples of that. Also in urban areas, there's a lot that you can do to support local wildlife. You're not going to be able to exactly recreate the pre-European vegetation from your site, but you can certainly do amazing things to support local wildlife. The examples on the screen here are both butterfly gardens. However, there's lots of other related gardens, pollinator gardens, things to attract local birds. It's amazing what a difference you can make, and especially if you can use your project site to inspire others to do the same. So maybe plant similar plants in their gardens. We can have a much bigger impact on a wider landscape scale. And finally, the last set of examples of a particular project purpose. As you can see, this one is water management. The image on the left is from a school rain garden. So previously water would run off over the hard surfaces and go straight into the stormwater system. Here they capture that water and allow it to permeate into the ground. The middle example is a similar concept. You're probably aware of rain gardens in street verges like that. And the one on the right highlights permeable surfaces. So in the grant guidelines, it mentions that we can fund the removal of impermeable surfaces and replace that with permeable. Obviously, that then allows the rain or any surface water to infiltrate into the ground. The next planning principle is site assessment. So think about what currently is at your site. Are there any components that you may need to change? Are there any things that you can make use of? So for example, vegetation. Do you have any plants on the site? Are they local plants, as in are they local native plants, or are they exotic plants? What function might they currently provide? So for example, do they provide shade, or are they a great habitat for wildlife? Now, don't just think about this time of year, but try and think back through the year. Have you seen any animals utilizing those plants? If so, maybe you might like to consider keeping them and work around that. The other thing to think about is the size of your site. So have you got a really large site? Have you got a small site? Is it sloping? Might there be issues with erosion from stormwater? All those things need to be taken into consideration when you're planning your site. The other thing might be soil type. So look at the soil. Is it heavy clay? Is it sandy? Is it loam? How might you test that? You could potentially do a ribbon test to look at the clay content. You might even want to do a pH test. In an urban setting, it's really unusual for the soil to be the natural soil. Often it's been heavily modified. The topsoil might have been scraped away. There's all sorts of issues that could potentially you might come across. So think about, assessing your soil. How might you overcome some of those issues? If it's really heavy clay, you might think about adding gypsum. You might think about including organic matter into the soil. That can help if it's sandy or clay. So there's a number of things that you can think about when assessing the soil. The next thing with your site assessment, think about sunlight. So where does the sun go through the day? So look at your site in the morning, through the day, in the afternoon. Is it shady at certain times of the day? And importantly, seasonally. So think about how that sun might change through the year. During summer, you might have full sun at your site, but in winter, when the sun is a lot lower in the sky, you might have quite a few months of just total shade for your site, particularly if you have a large building or a large tree to the north of your site. So think about that and maybe plan planting appropriately, depending on whether the plants are tolerant to sun or shade. There are a number of other things that you can think about when you're doing your site assessment, but they're just a few to get you started. Next up, the design and getting the measurements of your site. This is important for two reasons. One, it'll help you with planning your project. If you have a drawing or a mud map or some aerial photography, you can plan exactly what components are going to be where in your project site. But the other important aspect here is for the grant assessment panel. If you have a clear visual explanation, that is going to be really useful for the grant assessment panel to understand exactly what it is you're going to be doing. And with regards to the measuring, in the grant application, we also ask for the area in meters squared of your site. So there are a number of ways you can get that information. You can physically go out with a tape measure and measure it, or there are a number of online tools. A couple that we are showing on the screen currently. Nature Maps is a state government spatial database that has all sorts of information, but there are some measuring tools in there. But probably an easier option is using Google Earth. To access Google Earth, just open your web browser and search for the term Google Earth, then navigate to your project site. You'll see there are a couple of tools up the top here called Measure Distance and Area, or the Path and Polygon tool. Essentially, they do the same thing. So we'll click the measuring tool. Let's pretend this is my project site. So if it has straight edges, you just click in each corner, just do a rough estimation. And as you can see on the right here, it not only gives you the perimeter, but the area in meters squared. And as I said earlier, that is a figure that is required in our grant application form. If, for example, your site doesn't have straight edges, you can still use either of these tools. You just start by clicking and then just do little multiple clicks as you follow the curve of the path, for example, here. I won't do the whole thing, but you get the idea. Get back to the start and you can see again how many meters squared. The other benefit of Google Earth is that you can take a screen capture of your project site image and use that as the basis for any maps that you can then incorporate your design components into. Once you've measured up, the next thing on the list is plant selection. Now, it's important to identify the roles that plants are going to play in your site and how they will be arranged. Depending on the purpose of your project, there are a number of different tools that we can provide that will help you select the appropriate species. If you're just doing a general urban greening project, then the Botanic Gardens Plant Selector is a great tool. Essentially, you just plug in your suburb or postcode and it spits out a huge list of all the plants that would survive in your particular location. The majority of those are exotic plants, but there certainly are lots of natives and even local natives in that list. You can export the list and filter by size or whether they're shade loving, their spread, etc. So there's lots of information about those plants. If your purpose is more focused on urban wildlife, then an example there on the screen, the Adelaide Gardens Planting Guide, provides a lot of information about general local native species for the wider Adelaide region. You can see there's also a link to the Plants of Green Adelaide website, which has heaps of information about specific plants. If you're going to be doing a conservation project, then definitely get in touch with us because we have specific plant lists for the different vegetation types throughout Adelaide. So for example, if you're in a grey box and SA blue gum woodland area, we can provide you with the exact species mix that you would then incorporate into your project site. So now that you've done the research and decided what plants you are going to incorporate into your project, where do you get them? As you can see on the screen, we recommend that it's actually really important to seek out an established, reliable nursery. So the 3 examples on the screen, State Flora, Trees for Life or Providence. However, there are a number of other nurseries, ones that specialize in local native plants, but then also other nurseries as well. So definitely seek out a reliable nursery. We do have another extended list of local native plant nurseries on our Green Adelaide website. So certainly seek that out if you are after some local native plants. So now we know what species mix we are getting and we know where we're purchasing them from. The next comes the scale and placement. In other words, how are you going to design your site? Where are those plants going to go? Are you going to incorporate any paths or any seating as we talked about earlier? Where might some of the trees go? Where might some of the shrubs or ground covers go? So thinking back to that shading or where the sun travels, if you have a seating area and you want to maybe shade it in the afternoon sun, because that's where some people might sit after work, for example, maybe you might plant some big trees on the western side of that seating area. You might have a western facing wall that you want to shade from the sun so that the building doesn't heat up. So again, maybe you might plant some trees there. If you're going to incorporate paths into your garden design, think about the plants that will grow adjacent to that path. You might want to try and avoid ones that will grow over onto the path and get in people's way, or maybe even avoid large shrubs or trees that will potentially block the view of the rest of the garden. So there are quite a few things that you need to consider when you are designing your garden and thinking about the placement and numbers of all the different plants. So yes, that's just a few examples of some of the things that you might like to consider when you're laying out your garden design. Here are some examples of a couple of project plans for some grants that we have funded previously. This first one, as you can see, it's the Nativity Parish project, and they've just done a hand-drawn mud map. If you look closely, you can see all the different plants, where they're going to be located, the groupings of plants, and also some of the pathing areas. As you can see, it doesn't have to be complex, just a hand-drawn map is fine. The second example here is a verge planting, and they've gone and engaged a professional and come up with that design at the top right. Obviously it's done on a computer, but for the assessment panel's perspective, either of those options is acceptable. As I've reiterated a few times, as long as they can get a really clear understanding of exactly what it is you're doing and see that you've taken the effort to think about the planning of your project site, that ticks all the boxes. The next planning principle to consider is site preparation. So there are a few different examples here for things that you need to consider. So earthworks to begin with. Irrespective of size, any work that you do has the potential to damage assets which are located under the ground. So what used to be known as Dial Before You Dig is now called Before You Dig Australia. So certainly make use of that resource to find out if there are services under your project site. But also, are you going to be removing any hard surfaces which radiate heat? If so, how much of that needs removing? If it's a small component, maybe you might go and hire tools, a jackhammer, and do it yourself. If so, how are you going to dispose of that waste? If it's a large site, then yeah, you might get a contractor in. So think about the costs, think about how that might happen, when that might happen. So investigate all those aspects around the earthworks. With the soil, we have obviously talked about soil earlier in the presentation. So are you going to need to improve the soil? So think about some of those things that we talked about earlier. Mulch is another component that you might like to incorporate into your project. However, if you're doing a conservation-based project, you may not be using mulch. But any other urban greening project, yeah, mulch is really important. As I'm sure you're aware, it can suppress weeds, it can conserve soil moisture, and do all sorts of number of things. So there are a number of different types of mulch. So do your research and find out what is the most appropriate for your situation. Irrigation too is something that we can fund as part of the Grassroots grant. The photo here is drip irrigation, and that's certainly something that we would recommend. You can obviously put mulch over the top of that to make it look neater, but yeah, certainly think about whether you need irrigation at your site or whether you may be able to get away without it. If you did need to bring in additional soil to your project site, or potentially, if you were going to use mulch, you of course need to work out how much of it you need. Now on the screen is a simple calculation, the length, the width by the depth of your mulch or soil, and that'll give you the cubic meters of how much you actually need. But going back to our Google Earth example earlier, obviously we showed you how to work out the area, irrespective of whether your site had straight edges or had curved edges. You can use that area, obviously then times that by the depth of soil or mulch that you need, and that'll give you your answer in cubic meters. So obviously then you can use that to order how much you need, and also that information will be required to be entered into our grant application form. The final planning principle is establish and maintain. This is a really important one, especially from a Grassroots grant perspective, in that we don't want to provide money for a project that within a year or two might die and degrade. There's actually a couple of questions in the application form around the legacy and also the maintenance of your site. So yeah, really strongly think about that. Some of the things we've talked about earlier, watering. So are you going to irrigate? How are you going to go about it? Mulch, again, we just talked about that recently. So are you going to incorporate mulch? Another consideration are tree guards. Are you going to use them or not? There's pros and cons with both options. The ones in the photo are from many years ago, and they were plastic core flute ones. Nowadays, we'd recommend using compostable tree guards. The benefit of them, if you're, say, for example, a school or a sporting club, you can get the kids or your club members to decorate them in your team colours, or we've seen schools decorate them with environmental messages or drawings of butterflies. So it's a really great way to incorporate other people into your project. But certainly if you are, say for example, in a high traffic area, or you have rabbits or kangaroos that might eat your new seedlings, certainly tree guards are recommended. But then in other situations, yeah, you could probably get away without tree guards. So have a think about that and have a think whether you need them or not. So those are just some examples of things that you might like to consider when you're looking at how you're going to maintain your project site into the future. We've talked a few times through the presentation about contractors. Is this something you need? Obviously, if they're things that you can't do yourself, then certainly you will need an external contractor. Feel free to talk to the Green Adelaide Inquiries Officer or even your local council to get some advice around whether you might need a contractor. But as you can see, the dot points below, be really clear with your contractor on what it is that you want. They may have ideas or preferences, but if you have your project plan that we talked about earlier, that'll outline to them exactly what it is you're wanting to achieve. So that'll make it easier for you both to come to an agreement. Do a bit of research. Does this contractor have the expertise that you're looking for? Can you potentially visit any sites of their previous work? You can check obviously their quality of their work or their reliability. You might ask around, see if you know anyone else that has used that contractor. And you can also check up their ABN just to make sure that they're a legit company. There's a number of online tools such as ABN Lookup that you can use. And the other point there is about quotes. Now, there's no requirement from Green Adelaide that you have to get multiple quotes, but certainly it can be in your best interest to at least get a couple just to see, whether you're in the ballpark, whether that contractor is not overcharging you. Especially for larger projects, quotes from contractors can vary quite significantly. So you don't necessarily want to go for the cheapest one, but certainly the best value for money, taking into account the other things that we've just mentioned. So what are some other considerations? The key one here is don't rush. The grants are actually legislated to occur annually. It can be quite a process to collate all the quotes, all the permissions, etc. If you can't get that done before the grants close, then feel free to wait. In 12 months' time, we'll be running these grants again, and that'll give you plenty of time to obviously think about your project and really improve your potential application. Look at your members and partners. So what skills and expertise do you have in your group? If, for example, you're a school or you're a sporting club, are there any families that might have landscapers in there or might have equipment that you could potentially borrow? If there is, certainly approach them and tap into that. Looking at risk management. So in the guidelines, you might have already seen that projects above $50,000 require a separate risk management plan. Those under $50,000, there's some questions you have to answer in the application form. So certainly think about any risks and how you might mitigate those. Are there any working bees that you're going to involve with your project? One of the key things we really look for is partnerships. So if you're a sporting group, can you maybe get a local school involved? Or are there any other community groups that you can involve? So working bees are a great opportunity to get those external partners as part of your project and get them helping out. Access to the equipment, we covered that in the, when we're talking about any members that might have equipment or anyone that you might be able to borrow stuff from. And thinking about your capacity to deliver. So again, if there are some components of your project that are beyond the capacity of your group, then certainly contractors or consultants you can get in to do that. And the final thing on this slide here is obviously landholder or manager approval. And this is a really important component, and the application form for the grant does require evidence that you have sought and have approval from the land manager. So for example, if you're a community group looking to do a project on council land, you'll need approval from the council. You might be working in a national park, therefore you'll need approval from the National Parks and Wildlife team for that particular park. It might be a school, you'll get permission from your principal. So they're just some examples of those approvals. Now we understand that some of those approvals can actually take quite a while to get approved. So if the deadline for the grants comes up and you still haven't got your formal approval, as long as you can show evidence that you have approached the landowner and you've got some in principle agreement, and that is sufficient to put in your application, and the expectation is that yes, down the track we'll obviously get that formal approval. So hopefully that's given you a good overview of some of the things that you'll need to consider when planning and designing your project. The links on the screen are just a summary of the different things that we've talked about through the presentation. They'll be available in the description below this video for you to actually access and click them. The following screen here is a summary of the different Green Adelaide staff members that you can contact if you have specific questions or would like specific advice about your project. As you can see, they're categorized into different project areas, and this list is available at the end of the grant guidelines. So thank you very much for listening and good luck with your application.